Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, so I'm on Gadigal land, where I live, work and write. And I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present. And of course, because I'm at the library today, which is a bit unusual for me, I'm actually in country as well. And for all of those who have missed being in the Mitchell Wing and that beautiful Sydney sandstone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the library, and I look after our paid fellows, people who are given a small amount of funding to explore our collections in depth. And it's very exciting today. One of our recently established fellowships, the Steele Fellowship, has only had a few scholars through the program, and it's great to have Robert Phiddian with us this morning. He's a professor at Flinders University. He has been a great champion for the humanities across a wide variety of disciplines for most of his career as an academic, lobbying for that voice that the humanities can contribute to a better society. He's here today with his research from the library and talking about larrikinism in Smith's Weekly and that great tradition of Australian cartoons. Thanks so much, Robert.
Thank you, Rachel. And so we're all seeing, let's see what we're seeing. We're all seeing a big screen with some pictures on the left of cartoonists from Smith's Weekly, I hope.
Not quite yet, Robert.
No? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the State Library and Ross Steele for the opportunity to do this work, which has been taking me a surprisingly large amount of time because, of course, of COVID. So I'm speaking to you today from Garnerland, Adelaide, in the Adelaide Plains, and I acknowledge their elders and the land that I live and work on. How are we going with the presentation?
Still can't see the slides. I'm just going to ask Beck if she can see.
Oh, hold on. I have to do, of course. Stupid me. I have to actually do the slide sharing, don't I?
This place.
It
went perfectly in rehearsal.
What's a humanities academic? Does that look better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Smith's Weekly, I'll explain about that in a moment. So here are my acknowledgements. I speak from Garnerland. I'm working, the large project that this is part of is a history of Australian editorial cartooning, which I'm working on with Richard Scully of the University of New England, Stephanie Brooks of Monash University, and Lindsay Foyle, retired cartoonist and fount of all knowledge on things cartooning. And so we have an ever approaching deadline to get that done. I'd like to thank, I'd like to thank the State Library as already have. And it's none of the images is extremely offensive, but certainly some of the images you see will be may be offensive by current standards, particularly in terms of sexism and racism, because we are going back to the between war years. So I apologise in advance and will probably apologise occasionally from time to time as I go through, but please take that as a general warning. So Smith's Weekly, sorry, larrikinism. And Melissa Belanta wrote a history of larrikins, and the important thing historically to understand is that it was a term of abuse for much of its history until the second decade of the 20th century, as Belanta dates it, and so far as I can tell remained a description of an urban thug really until about until the 50s. So until 1910s, larrikin was overwhelmingly a term of abuse for defiant self-identification for a young scoundrel, a hoodlum, and it was particularly an urban thing. This changes in this period to some extent as a consequence of the experience of World War I. And so, as Balanta says, it was only immediately before and during the First World War, when Australian soldiers branded themselves diggers and began celebrating their affinity with larrikins, that the term started to detach itself from its connection. And the other thing that it attaches to, the other thing that's happening here is that the bush myth of 19th century Australia, the rugged bushman, increasingly comes to town and creates the modern larrikin. So there's an image there from the most famous of the Smith's Weekly cartoonists, Stan Cross, about whom I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. There, which I take to be an illustration of the sort of figure that we're talking about. And so Peter Kirkpatrick in his Seacoast of Bohemia talks about a tension also between nationalist bush legend and cosmopolitanism, the country and the city tension, because we think of ourselves as a nation defined by the bush, but in so many ways we are city dwellers. So my hunch is that something similar happens with Smith's Weekly. With larrikin, we need terms like cosmopolitan, chauvinist, bohemian, bourgeois, respectable, moralistic. So things, as always, things are proving to be more interesting, but also more complicated than one's initial framework defines. And I know that it's a bit dangerous to be talking about these things, but it's also a very important topic, the question of national humours. I don't think there is such a thing as a quintessential Australian national sense of humour, not in an exclusive and precise sense. But I think larrikinism is something something real in a complicated sense. It's a difficult word in academic circles because of its resonance in the culture wars, for which I give you this image of a recent presentation from the Batuta Advocate in response to Dean's book on the death of the Aussie larrikin, and I have personally obliterated the most offensive word on that, just to make the point that this is still something that people argue about, and they argue about it because I think it has some meaning. So my question is, can the term be revived as part of a more plural story of national humour styles? In my case, particularly in the history of cartooning, but I think this is a wider project as well. And one way into this is a study of the Smith's Weekly, which I've been talking about in a sort of in a vague way for a minute or two. So one way into these shark-infested waters. So come with me for a swim. Smith's Weekly was born on the 1st of March 1919. The cartoon on the left has struck me as extraordinarily topical in the last couple of years, because of course that was the time of the Spanish influenza, and the wake of World War I, particularly the Spanish influenza. And depending on how big your screen is, you may have difficulty reading the caption. The man there, the older man, well, we don't have to wear masks here, but we must keep 6 feet away, but I must keep 6 feet away from you. So they're outside, presumably, and her response is, thank goodness. You could have reprinted that cartoon most times in the last couple of years. So, an interesting time. Nation in shock from war and in chaos from the response to the influenza. It was a weekly journal based in Sydney. very much in the shadow of the bulletin, but the bulletin, which had started in the 1880s, was entering its decline into a fairly decrepit middle age at this stage. And Smith's was much more a populist, much more a populist newspaper, but also more popular. It had three very distinct decades when you think about it. It started at the dawn of the Roaring Twenties. It then survived through the 1930s during the Depression, and then through the 40s, the war years, and then expired ultimately in 1950 as a consequence of various forces, including the fact that the building they were in was sold at a profit. So it's a very Sydney story, and that is increasingly my understanding of media history. I've born in Melbourne, lived in Adelaide for more than half my life, but if you're doing media history in Australia, Sydney is the centre of the universe in various ways. And consequently, the most important collection is the State Library of New South Wales. What do these look like? So these cartoons, the paper was defined in particular by its cartoons, and here's an illustration of what I think I mean by this early period of the larrikin spirit. This is a cartoon by Cecil Hart, who was a returned serviceman, and this has Billy Hughes at Versailles in the wash up after World War I. So this is a peace conference. That's Hughes. There's also David Lloyd George there, Maréchal Foch, Georges Clemenceau, and Woodrow Wilson, all being rendered, all being panicked by Hughes as the wild colonial boy. So that is, in terms of style and in terms of content, the new confidence, perhaps, of Australia as a consequence of the experience of soldiers, in particular, in World War I. So, as I said, it existed through these 3 decades. It's populist. It was national in distribution with mildly modified state editions, but really only mildly modified. I've spent a bit of time looking at that now. The money was put up by Sir James Joynton Smith, thus the name. He had been Mayor of Sydney. He was a former publican. He was one of the major boosters for war loans. And he backed Claude Mackay and Clyde Packer to build a newspaper. He was prepared to lose money for a couple of years. And fortunately, he was right. It started turning a profit fairly quickly after the routine losses, and it was always marked very strongly by the cartoonists. Not only were they paid well, they were actually kept on staff. So this was a weekly journal with a dozen cartoonists at any one time, or up to a dozen, and that is certainly amazing now when you consider that national broadsheets will have 1 or 2 before they're being paid per published cartoon. Physically, it's a broadsheet. Remember broadsheets, with busy pages, but relatively modern for the era. At this stage, the Sydney Morning Herald still had a front page made entirely of classified advertisements, and you had to leaf through to find anything that resembled news, and you had to wait a few decades to see anything that resembled amusing caricature in that particular journal. So many cartoons. Depending on how you count them, cartoons, caricatures, you've got to separate them out from advertisements, of course. But in a fairly typical number, in a fairly typical number, from 1933, I counted 82 in the 24 pages. It went to tabloid format during the war, during the Second World War, as a consequence of paper shortages, and stayed that way through to the end. Intended routinely to be 24 pages. So it travelled the Federation, the Federated Nation, and was especially associated, as we'll talk about in a moment, with returned soldiers. And the thing I particularly have already stressed, but I think is important, is that it focused as much on city life as on the bush. That it reflects a society beginning to think of itself as living in cities, as I'll show in a few illustrations before long. It had a legendarily hard drinking culture among the journalists and cartoonists, even by the standards of mid-20th century Australian media. I think that's even possibly true. And it, as we'll see at the end of this presentation, it expired rather suddenly in 1950. So what did the cartoonists look like? What have I been looking at? On the odd occasion, I've managed to get to the State Library through the various barriers cast up by our recent troubles. So here I'll go through a few cartoons, and it was first and foremost the Diggers' champion, taking over from the Bulletin, which was focused still on bush life. It particularly supported the returned servicemen. I particularly like the one on the left there, from Frank Dunn. So this was done by Cecil Hart for a few years until he sadly took his own life, and followed up by Frank Dunn. And the Frank Dunn one reads, what are we fighting for anyhow? So this is very much a scene from the trenches, a place in the sun. And that's the sort of gag cartoon that was happening in this newspaper. It wasn't very directly political. The politicisation of our cartoons is perhaps a feature particularly since the 1960s. It was, and in a weekly newspaper, a joke can't afford to be overtaken by the news cycle. So there's literally, well, there would be thousands of cartoons on themes supporting returned servicemen all the way through the paper, but particularly in a regular feature. This is just one example from 1929, the unofficial history of the AIF. And so this was very much part of the identity of the paper. The guy who ran the lift in the building for years and years was a returned serviceman who had lost a leg. Apparently he could always finish his anecdotes by whatever floor he was taking you to, I just read the other day. And there's this sense of the dry Australian soldier now, rather than bushman. And that perhaps is part of the important mythifying. So this is very much a digger as a larrikin. There's a tension between country and city that I've already mentioned here. These are cartoons by Jim Russell and a Dad and Dave cartoon. Everyone owned Dad and Dave in the period. On the right, that I can't identify an author of. And these are, again, standard, not hugely funny jokes, but the drama of the office comes more and more into the cartoons in the 20s and 30s, including, of course, sexual politics in the office, and I think obviously the casual sexism of the Jim Russell cartoon there. I'm afraid your typing in shorthand aren't good enough to get you a job, says the boss, the applicant. I wasn't counting much on them. And so, so the urbanisation of life, office life, the life of the daily traveller. Other themes that they were very interested in: bureaucracy and marriage. Divorce is a very prominent theme in Smith's Weekly. Divorces were always controversial at the time. They required court cases, so maybe that made them newsworthy. The Johnson cartoon I find especially unfunny. The old mother-in-law joke: "Your daughter doesn't want to leave her father." That's an idea. Take her too. Whereas I find the anti-bureaucracy one there by George Finey, who had a complicated career as a cartoonist. He was eventually sacked from a pack of paper for being a socialist. I find that one rather more interesting. So this is the view of the civil service and all these bureaucrats who've managed to murder someone by their pens. And it has a sort of rather sinister look. Some of them even wear dark glasses. They all wear glasses, of course. I'm often asked, where are the female cartoonists? And the answer is there aren't many. And so we may wish to talk about that in question time. I think that's quite possible. But Smith had about as many as there ever have been. Particularly for a long time, Molly Horseman and Joan Morrison, here with their distinctive styles. There's a quality of urban sexism here, but it's also bringing in female agency in interesting ways. The women are getting to have more of a life in these cartoons, and I think also in the cartoon. What's your opinion of a girl who marries for money? Not much. She should be able to get it out of him without going that far. I think that's a reasonably sharp joke, and affectionately drawn. Similarly, the woman seems to be more affectionately drawn in the Horseman cartoon than the two gawking men. Very much Popeye sort of style. And another cartoonist who was there for a very long time, Virgil Riley, created a sort of 20s flapper Virgil girl. And this brings in the bohemian sophistication in a populist journal that I'm interested in. Always, of course, in this era signified by smoking. That's no longer the case, as we now know. So what are you doing this weekend? Oh, nothing to speak of. I thought you'd given up that sort of thing. And these cartoon jokes were often delivered to the newspaper and illustrated by cartoonists. This was still very much happening, and they were quite willing to pay for a good joke idea. And that was part of the hothouse effect. So our idea of the cartoonist having always to think of the whole idea as well as do the execution didn't apply through the 19th and well into the 20th century. And I just kind of like the lines on that one, but maybe that says more about me than anything else. It's still very much conditioned by the male gaze. I don't pretend otherwise, but there does seem to be more female agency in this world. And more bohemia. The great poet Kenneth Slessor wrote for the paper and indeed edited it for a time. Wrote for the paper for many years, and he collaborated with Virgil from time to time on a series of poems, and we're beginning to get we were clearly getting an Art Deco sort of feel here, and yeah, occasional popular poetry, but really rather good, it seems to me. when the stars, so Darlinghurst nights, when the stars are lit by neon, where the fried potato fumes and the ghost of Mr. Villon still inhabits single rooms, and the girls lean out from heaven over Lightwell's thumping mops, while the gent in 57 cooks his pound of mutton chops. Even there, flowers are floating in the air, eyes are gloating, borders doting, flowers are floating even there. You can tell that Slessor was a talented poet. That seems to me to have an extremely lyrical sort of echo, even of T.S. Eliot. That sense of sense of urban alienation, and it was certainly very interesting on the trip I've actually managed to make to Sydney, to stay in the area, of, around Darlinghurst, and get the sense of that apartment living, which was relatively new and certainly focused particularly on that part of Sydney then. So that's Slessor and Virgil, and I come now to Stan Cross, who's the most famous of the cartoonists. There from the beginning to 1939, when he left for other pastures. He was brought over from Perth, then practically a village on the Swan River, in 1919, and paid well, and became the father figure of the cartoonists at Smith's, and indeed for the Cartoon Association that he was integral to setting up, which is about to have its centenary in a year or two, being the oldest cartoonist association in the world, the Australian one. George Blakey, who was a journalist at the paper from 1930 or so onwards, and has written a book about a very good book, really, of reminiscence about Smith, describes Cross thus: the purest vein of Australian humour developed by Smiths was probably the Jackie type of gag. And I apologise for the language here, it is from 66, of which Stan Cross was the undisputed master. Stan not only devised the merriest abo jokes, never a cruel one from Stan, but presented them with an artistry that is still quite breathtaking. Pardon me, are you a Christian? Royal Lummy Charlie. Ain't it bad enough to be a plurry blackfella? I think you can see Blakey's argument here. Obviously, it's obviously racist. Every image of Aboriginal people in the period was, but the presence of or absence of cruelty in racist images from the past does seem to be worth trying to gauge, if only to calibrate criticism rather than to excuse them. And it seems to me that the Wowser Christian here is more the butt of the joke. He's certainly bigger than the Aboriginal character, but he's wearing idiotic clothing for the heat, and an umbrella. And it seems to me that this is probably, at least in context, more part of the attack on Wowsers and Killjoys in the paper than it is on Aboriginal people. And it would be fair to say that while the bulletin was raucously in favour of white Australia right through this period, Smith's wasn't too bad, again, by the standards of the era. After a bad, routinely anti-Semitic start, Blakey argues, and I think you can see that it's true, that the rise of Hitler made Smith Weekly quite sympathetic to Jews and also quite sympathetic to Aboriginals. Other other races didn't get treated with any great gentleness. But even well, yeah, maybe I'm just justifying because I spend so much time on it. But I think it's worth thinking about the difference between that and cruelly dismissing gags. And here's the image that if you've seen anything from Smith Weekly, this may be the one that you've seen. This is the famous "Stop Laugh," for God's sake, stop laughing, this is serious. And here I'm using the image of the original, fairly recently discovered and now in the collection of the National Library in Canberra. After many people thought it was lost irrevocably. It's from page 3 of the Sydney edition of Smith's Weekly on the 29th of July 1933. And I spent many hours last year trying to work out what was going wrong, because it doesn't appear on Trove, the digitisation of newspapers. And the reason, well, let's go here. This is how it looked in the paper. So a really big cartoon and dominant. So far as I know, there is only one copy of this now in existence, because the copy of the reference edition of Smith's Weekly in the State Library of New South Wales had this page ripped out. I've seen the rip marks. It's definitely the case. And a photocopy put in from page 16 of the Melbourne edition. So the interstate editions were effectively the early editions. We've written about this at great length, and it'll come out in the Journal of Australian Studies next year. But for some reason, the State Library of South Australia collected all the editions, and you people are some of the earliest people to view the cartoon in its original context for many decades now. And this is a question about cartoons, a question I've always that I'm always interested in your opinions of. Which of these is the true version of the cartoon? The version on the paper or on the page with the context around it, or the original artwork? And this is a question about, obviously, if we're talking fine arts, if we're talking paintings, then the original matters more than any possible copy or any contextualisation. But with cartoons, it's a critical art form, and there you can see you can see how it fits in, and in the general context of the paper, as a in the period of the in the period of the Depression, in the period of the very first skyscrapers. The Empire State Building was just going up at that stage in New York. There weren't really buildings much like that in Sydney yet, and of course the official, that is the one of the most official versions, one of the most fabled versions of larrikin humour, that dry humour in extremity. So here are some more or less critical perspectives on Smith. They change with time. Blakey described it as critical, raspberry firing, fast punching, capable of smelling a sacred cow from afar off against the wind. We have Vane Lindsay, not much, the great chronicler of Australian cartooning, not much longer away. Smith's Weekly humour never varied, humour about sex, not sexy humour, drinking and drunks, soldier humour, horse racing humour, Dad and Dave, rural humour, and a new departure in Australian urban humour, the theme of divorce, interesting for its comic cynicism. We go on through time and we start to, Sylvia Lawson's excellent book from the 1980s, that's the second edition, date 2006, about Archibald, the Archibald paradox, is rightly more critical of the fact that Smith was all masculine gags and smartness. His editorial line was nationalist, somewhat truculent, heavily racist, well to the right, not convinced by the well to the right. I think the populism was more random than that, that it rolled with Menzies Australia, certainly. And if that's your definition of well to the right, then Lawson is correct. But I think it's a messier thing than that. And most recently, another State Library Fellow, Sally Young, talks about it as witty and cheeky, lively cartoons, lots of illustration, well-paid artists. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And also anti-party politics that admired Hughes. So those are some views that scholars have had, all of which shed some light on what we'll eventually write about this. It's particularly the dominant role of the cartoonist as giving a flavour, a character, a soul to the weekly newspaper. So it was directed at an average reader who was white, male and middle class, says Fitzpatrick back in 1992. And he talks, I think, very interestingly about larrikinism. It was as much a negative thing, a Philistine defensive posture as an affirmative national strategy. And when we're talking about national humour, we aren't necessarily talking about myth-making. Myths not in the sense that it's all wrong, but in the sense that they're stories that make sense. They're stories that make sense to us. The history of Smith cannot be a simple celebration. It engages in myths that have had real cultural and political consequences that are still echoing today. And to finish, I'm going to take you into the archive in this last couple of minutes. A box I found last February. More or less, yeah, at the end of the week I had, when I say last February, actually I mean February 2021. It was a box number 840 for 24 items, and it had images from Smith's Weekly. And they were original artwork, marked up with the gags. So we've got on the left here something by Jean Cullen, another female cartoonist. It's my wife, Nurse. She doesn't like me being alone with strange women, so the wife's staying there. Another one of the sort of routine jokes of the era, and a rather beautiful thing by Unk White on the right, with just put yourself in my shoes, says the swaggy lady, and you won't have a care in the world. I don't know whether that's a comment on high heels precisely. And what my problem was that I couldn't find where these appeared in the paper. I'd got quite good by this stage of reverse engineering, finding dates for original artwork that's within Trove, and Smith's fortunately lives entirely within Trove as well. As long as you've got a printed caption, and Smith's cartoons all have printed captions, the word recognition software will generally find the captions. And I was increasingly mystified by why these cartoons that were clearly cartoons that were 3 columns on the colour, they were clearly marked up to go in the paper, hadn't. So I worked through patiently. I worked from the top to the bottom, which is part of the plot for this final story. And I finally found one that was in the paper. You should consider yourself lucky, Mr. Hallstrom. Yourself lucky. Mr. Hallstrom would give me £75 for it by Norm Rice. And this was published in the last edition of the newspaper, the 28th of October, 1950. As it happens, I think the £75 there is probably picked up from the payment for a joke suggestion, because you can see that in the box there's also accepted joke suggestion by someone. £75 for it. That seems an awful lot to pay for very joke suggestion. Although Mr. Hallstrom wasn't the person who paid them. Mr. Hallstrom ran the zoo at this stage, so I imagine it's a bug in the soup joke. So I finally found one. It certainly wasn't the best of them. Yeah, it's not a bad cartoon. It's just not particularly brilliant. And then I kept working on. And at the bottom, there were actually 2 copies of the front page of the paper with signatures all over it of people from the paper. So we've got Jean Cullen over there on the right. George Blakey's one of the signatures on this. So it's people who are actually there. And there I was on the last day of this newspaper that I've been studying. As Blakey says, in the few weeks up to the 28th of October, the last print date, you can feel the paper dying under you. Claude Mackay, who got it underway in the first place, had come and gone a couple of times since. Got Sir Keith Murdoch of the Herald interested in taking over and reviving Smith, but just a little bit too late. The shares had been sold when he showed his hand. So there you are. There I was, with them in their last minutes. I couldn't smell any beer on the newsprint, but I'm sure had I been there early enough in time, that smell would still have been available. And that's part of the fun of this. So I hope to be back soon, but we do live in strange times. And my final image will be the ticket they gave me at Adelaide Airport when I passed the health interrogation on return from my last trip to Sydney in February 2021. Yeah, admit one. That was how we finished. And now I'm done, so I need to end slideshow. Stop share. Okay.
Thanks so much, Robert. We've got some questions and comments that have come through. If you'd like to ask Robert a question, please just use the chat feature in Zoom. We've got about 10 minutes to interrogate him and his work. The first comment that's come through is really an interesting one, and it alludes back to your idea of what is the original, which is, of course, a question that would fascinate libraries endlessly, and asking you to say a little bit more about the difference between cartoons as art and cartoons as journalism, which I think actually came through quite obviously when you had the 2 women artists, and you had Horseman, which presented an image that might look more obviously like a cartoon of the style that we're familiar with, and Morrison, which actually looked like a picture that then had the caption on it. Like you would not have, if you're sort of sorting through things, you might not have immediately given that a cartoon status. It looked like she'd spent a lot more time on it, or certainly had a very different style. So are you able to say a little bit more about art versus journalism, or are they the same?
It's a good question, and it's an important one. And I think probably caricature is the crucial handle on the difference. It seems to me that a cartoon has to work, has to be immediately apprehended, whereas a work of visual art can assume a greater effort, a greater time to understand it. So there will be recognisable caricatures. It's like in journalistic writing, literary writing. A journalist has to work in cliche, and I don't mean that as a criticism at all. But you've got to have immediate handles on things. So that's the first thing about it. Another thing about cartoons is that they get a lot of their meaning from their words. Whereas, grumpy old man prejudice, I don't think artwork I don't think fine art that requires you to read a lot is doing its job properly. I think it should be working in the primary, predominantly visual medium. And there's very little study of the words in cartoons, despite the fact that some of them are the sharpest imaginable. That's a project I intend to get to one of these days. And finally, you need to draw an awful lot of cartoons to keep the newspaper happy. And so the rate of production, it not only needs a caricature for recognition, it also needs a caricature to get through things fast enough. So those are the sorts of differences. And this does create some difficulties with the study of cartooning because we don't sort of belong to anyone. In fine arts world, it's often not looked down on a bit. In journalism studies, we're not always taken as seriously as we'd like to be. So it is definitely a mongrel art form that is interesting in a bunch of different directions. You can follow political change, you can follow. I've really more been following social change, I think, in that last presentation. So thanks for that.
So you made a comment just a moment ago about the words in the cartoon. Yeah. So some people here today are shocked/hurt. A few other adjectives have been used, that the people who did the cartoon didn't do the text.
Yep.
That went with it. And I think that we're so used to admiring cartoonists for not only their skill in visually representing something that we generally immediately recognise, even if we might not agree with it, we know exactly what it is, but also that keen observation as well. So the question is, can you talk a little bit more about when that became the one person or the one commentator even?
There's a particular single hero here. It's David Lowe, the New Zealand-born cartoonist who came initially to Australia from Christchurch, and very memorably drew Billy Hughes as a jumped-up little twerp, which, political commentary, bit out of date, but still probably a bit improper of me, and then moved on to England, and he's definitely an ambitious cartoonist, and he was very popular. He's most famous for his cartoons against Hitler and Stalin. He was actually on the Gestapo's hit list for when they invaded England. He was going to be lined up against the wall and shot. This paperwork exists, and Hitler complained a couple of times about him. And he was very popular, and he demanded independence. And so, in the 20s and 30s, he developed that particular role. Before then, and a lot of this has to do with the time with printing. Printing happens more slowly, and so and more deliberately in weeklies and monthlies in Punch and the Bulletin and so on. And the cartoons were there to illustrate things, and it's still the case that cartoonists will have a relationship with some writers, and they'll illustrate their opinion pieces. But that independence happened increasingly. So some of the cartoonists had more control than others over what they drew. They also got to choose the ideas. They got to improve the ideas. The original idea of Stop Laughing wasn't very funny at all until Stan Cross turned it into something else. So, and it's particularly since the 60s in Australia, when cartoonists have been viewed as free commentators.
I just don't think anybody wanted to believe that Cathy Wilcox didn't do both.
Oh, Cathy Wilcox absolutely does both. Now cartoonists have independence, and no one really messes with it. stupid editors try and suggest things to them. That generally doesn't work. And the only constraint, and it happens reasonably often, is that editors have a right of refusal. They don't have to accept a particular cartoon or idea.
We do have a
usually argue it's on taste.
We do have a few more questions which I want to try and race through so no one misses out.
Right.
Someone has asked quite specifically about Smith's Weekly, if you're able to shed more light on the anti-Semitism, which, as you say, was a feature of that masthead in the earlier era.
Well, in this instance, it's really more, it's really, there was a routine anti-Semitism in early 20th century Australia, which many people would know of. It didn't really start to get properly revised generally until after the experience of the Holocaust. But because of the pressures of the pressures of Jewish immigrants trying to get out of Germany, as things got worse and worse, this built pressure. And initially, Smith was just sort of routinely resistant, as popular culture is routinely resistant to each wave of new migrants. And then I don't have a precise date, I'm afraid, so I'm happy to follow up with and do that work if this person is very interested. But there was clearly a focus on what Hitler was doing, was on about in the relatively early 30s. It's 33 or 34 that they realised that no, this fascism stuff was really bad, and so they started not being anti-Semitic. So it's the absence of anti-Semitism and support, relative support for Jewish people that is a good news story from then, and puts it ahead of, for example, at the same time, the Bulletin.
And that leads into our next question. I want to try and knock off two more. What do you think about the ability of cartoons to perform political activism as these standalone, often quite powerful comments? And do you think we've lost any of that power in cartoons?
So cartoons, there's not a lot of history of cartoons having an immediate activist effect. I think they contribute to climates of opinion and changing climates of opinion. But the gotcha moment for cartoonists and other satirists are vanishingly rare. You can possibly start a controversy with a cartoon, and that certainly happens, but you won't get the instrumental effect that you're after, a transformation of society in some way or another. So that's the sort of glum story of 3 decades now, looking at political satire in various forms. Are we losing that? I think the thing that's complicating life for cartoons is the many platforms that everything exists on these days. So I am mentally a creature of the mass media in this respect. Where there are a handful of newspapers and magazines, you would have and that national debate, and it would be curated in various ways. Now a cartoon in particular seems only to go to the sectional interests who are most likely to agree with it.
I'm going to finish on this question and then we'll wrap up. Would you class all cartoonists as larrikins at heart?
I think yes. Obviously, I have to hand in my academics license for having just given such a straightforward answer. But that's my experience of them. That's my experience of their work. That they are interested in the way things operate, but they also want to put a stick in the spokes here and there, and they're interested in more freedom, relatively, whatever that means.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's been so great to have you this morning, and so great to have you all at work or at home, wherever you're dialing in from today. It's been fabulous to have your company for this, another one of our Scholar Talks. And thank you for your really great questions. And I hope that you can join us next time. So on Tuesday, the 3rd of May, again at 11 o'clock, we'll be talking to Jan Lanacek, and he's one of our Australian religious history scholars, and he's going to be talking about an Australian Holocaust, and quite a timely discussion, I think, about how conflict on the other side of the world can have a very deep impact here at home in Australia. Until then, thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone, and please stay safe. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.